Welcome to Dry Brushing with Acrylic Paints. Today we're going to be discussing not only how to dry brush, but what type of brushes to use and how to create form with dry brushing and combining dry brushing with floating. In my previous videos I discussed advanced floating and basic floating techniques, and so today I want to talk about how dry brushing can make creating form within a design that much easier. There are some basic supplies that you'll need for dry brushing. Again, you'll need some really good paper towels, and they have to be dry, so you always want to make sure that if you're floating and dry brushing on one project that you're going to have some dry paper towels set to the side just for this technique. You're also going to need some high quality brushes of which to dry brush with, and you can use many different brushes, and I'll be discussing that during this video. You'll also need some gel blending medium. There's many different brands out on the market, and I use this to condition my brushes. I also keep hand sanitizer nearby so that I can clean my brush, especially if I'm using a brush without any water in it. In my previous videos we discussed floating and how to do more advanced floats. So today I'm going to show you how to bring it together and also use dry brushing in order to create true form. You're going to need some basic supplies for dry brushing. So the first thing you're going to need is dry paper towel. If I'm working on a project where I'm floating and dry brushing, I make sure that I keep a paper towel to the side that is completely dry, so I will not pick up any moisture in the brush. You'll also need some good dry brushing brushes, and while you can use a variety of these, I find that I really like the dome shape brushes the best, and those are the ones that are tapered at the end. This has a rounded edge and can work fairly well, but I will show you the difference as to why I prefer a dome shaped brush. Many people are now also dry brushing with more of a filbert brush, and there's advantages and disadvantages to that. You'll also need some gel blending medium. Any brand will do. And this I'll use to condition my brushes. And to clean my brushes while I'm painting, I keep hand sanitizer, so I can simply put it in the hand sanitizer, clean the brush, and then completely dry it. Because this has alcohol in it, it will dry really quick. Essentially, dry brushing started centuries ago with the old masters. They would come in and add very transparent applications of paint with just residue of paint in their brushes. And even though they worked in oils, it was a form of dry brushing. More currently, with acrylic painting, it came back with stenciling, and so stencil brushes were being used then. And so using a nice stiff brush with a hog hair in it that is natural works very, very well. But the problem with a stenciling brush is if you load it into the paint, then I'm going to come in and take most of it out so that I only have a residue left. What happens is, as you come to your surface, you can cover larger areas, but it's very hard to control in a small area. And that's why I pretty much just use these brushes when I am stenciling. What I've done with this stencil brush is I've actually come in and I've cut the hairs. And you can easily do this if you want to create your own little dry brushing brush. And this works a little bit better because it's tapered. So I load my brush with paint. I really push my paint into the brush to make sure that it's getting into the middle of the brush too. I've seen a lot of painters just come in and barely touch it because they know that they only want a residue of paint. But then what happens is as they take the paint out, there's very little left in the brush to work with. So make sure you load your brush really well, and then you're going to come over and you're going to look for a residue of paint. So I don't know if you noticed, but I was rotating my brush. And what I'm looking for is when it goes from opaque to semi-transparent. So it's just a little bit of residue in that brush. And then what I do is I hold it like it's a pencil. And I can control this much more than I could with the stencil brush. And I have a nice gradation of color, and so what I'm going to do then is just fade it away. And obviously this is blue on a very light background, so if I was painting to create realistic form, I would have two colors that lay down really well. But what's really important is that you're going to get a more deep coverage of paint by working very slowly. And then you're going to come out and have a gradation here. Now the brush that I really like to use are my Monza rounds. And I like these because these are a much softer hair than the stenciling brushes. And I found that even when I was using that cut stencil brush, I was creating some texture, and I really want a more smooth application. This is a really soft hair brush, and it's synthetic, and it's in synthetic mongoose hair. So I take some gel blending medium, and I really work this into my brush because I'm working with dry paint. And because I'm working with dry paint in the brush, I want to make sure that I'm not going to ruin my brush. So you can see I've really loaded it in there. And then what I do is I come over and I take it all out, just like as if it was paint. And so what that's going to do is the gel blending medium is going to stay down in the bottom right next to the ferrule. So as I'm using the dry application of paint, it's not going to dry in here and ruin my brush. And so again, I make sure that I dry it out, and you can see on your paper towel that there's absolutely no moisture coming out, and it even feels dry then when you remove it all. So now I'm going to load the brush into paint, and with floating, we always load it from the side. When I'm dry brushing, I like to load from the center of the puddle because that's where the freshest paint is in the puddle. So then I'm going to come over again, and I'm going to rotate my brush as I'm cleaning most of the paint out of it. And I'm looking for that gradation of color. Once I have the gradation of color, I can go over to my surface, and then I use circular motion. I work fairly slowly so that I know that I am getting a nice even coverage of paint. And then when I get the application that I want, I will start lifting the pressure from my brush a little bit. And then I'll create a little bit of gradation. Now what I really like about dry brushing is it dries almost in the time that you have applied it. So I can go back in and I can add in a little bit more, as if, let's say this was a circular highlight and I wanted to build my values. So then I could come in and add just a little bit more. Building that opaqueness in the middle. But then I'll stop just in this area and really lift the pressure from my brush and allow it to fade away. So I have a nice gradation of color, and I can keep building my values like that. So now I'm going to switch to a different brush. So what I wanted to show you is, I want to clean this brush in case I want to use it later on. But I don't want to stick it in the water because I'm using a dry brush. So what I'll do is I'll come over and I'll come into that hand sanitizer, and I watch for all the paint to dissipate. So I started there, and then I wipe it out. So I can see that most of my paint is coming out of my brush, and I'll set it to the side. And what you can also do, you can wrap this with a baby wipe or with a dampened paper towel so that it doesn't completely dry on you. You can work with any brush, and as a matter of fact, the brush can even be dampened. What dry brushing is working with a residue of paint. This can be really confusing because I know there's a lot of different terms right now out there. Some people call it dry rubbing, some people call it just dry brushing. There's a lot of terms out there. And as a matter of fact, even in oils, it's called scumbling. What's important to know with the dry brushing technique, you're working with a residue of paint. So when you're working with a filbert, there's multiple ways that you can use the brush. What's really important is that you have just a residue of paint. So you could use a circular motion, but I really find that I prefer to use more of a drag pull. And you can see that there's a little bit of texture building up here. That's what you're looking with when you're dry brushing, is to begin with showing texture. Now, this can be really pretty if you're creating a shine to glass or wanting to create texture. You can create a really neat denim effect with this type of application. But what you can do is keep building your layers, and then eventually it fills in. Just like what I did here, I can come in and I can just really create a nice little shine. And I have a little bit more opaqueness in the center of it. Okay, so now let's talk about why we would use these instead of floating. I want to show you how easy it is to come in and put in your shade color and your highlight color without having to worry about walking out of float. So again, I want to start with a very narrow application of paint, and because my brushes are tapered, I can just come along the edge without having to worry about going the outside edge. And then I'm going to use a circular motion and build up my shade color. Again, I'm working fairly slowly. So the actual application of dry brushing can take a little bit more time than floating. But what is faster is your ability to build layers, because the dry brushing essentially dries as soon as you put in your shade color. So you can see we're starting to have a nice shade there. We can do the same thing with the highlight. And this would be in lieu of doing a circular float. You can come in and set your brush down. And this is just so easy to do. And this is one of the reasons why I started doing this dry brushing technique to create form about 25 years ago, is because I saw that my students were just really struggling with those circular floats, and I wanted them to be able to create some really pretty realistic things. And so I started dry brushing. So you can see how easy it was to do that. And it's the same with an oval float. If you remember, an oval float was a back-to-back float where you had to use a circular float at the end. Well, it's just so easy to do here. I'll start in the middle and go around the outside edges. And then as I'm finishing up, I lift my pressure off. And that's how we would put highlights onto a leaf. What I like also is you can go right up to an edge and put in a shade color. And all you do is work your brush back and forth. Now let's say that this was going to be an area that needed more of a wide float. Instead of walking out a float, you can dry brush this in. So you can see I started back and forth, and now I'm using the circular motion to pull it up. So you can see we have a nice gradation of color there. Instead of it doing a flip float or back-to-back float, we can also dry brush. And what I do is I use my circular motion to come down the center. And then I go around the outside edge. And as I'm going around that edge, I'm making sure that I'm blending my paint together. Now I'm painting on paper. If you're painting on a regular surface, it's going to blend a lot easier. So what's important is that we get that nice gradation of color. So I'm lifting my brush even lighter now. And you can't really see how much pressure I'm putting on it, so that's why I'm telling you what I'm doing. So you can see that this is going to fade out. And then also it's really easy to follow curvy edges. We can come in here and just go use that little back and forth motion. And then I just come in and soften it. And I can also follow an edge and do like a walked out float in the same manner. Now I'm working fairly fast in the interest of time for this demonstration. So as you are working at home, your speed's going to be more like this, so that you want to make sure you have a nice, even coverage. And one thing I wanted to warn you about too, once I'm done with this float, is to never ever flip your brush over during the middle of your dry brushing. Because as you're dry brushing, you're getting some full strength paint. So you can see the residue here. But see how strong it is there? It's much stronger on the other side. So I have to come back to my palette, work it in, and then I can come in and use that paint that's on the other side of the brush. Just like if we're floating, you can reinforce these. And with every application, they'll become a little bit more smooth and a little bit more even. So you can see I've really built this up in comparison to this first application here. I've come in 3 times now to really build this in and to make it a little bit more smooth and even. Now I want to discuss also our corner shading. because I know that many of you had a difficult time with the corner floats. So again, with these dome-shaped brushes, it's just so easy to get in that little area. And then slowly you can fade it away. And what's important then is you have some nice gradation to it. You can come back in and reinforce the bottom part and build those layers up. So it almost makes it look like it's been floated in there. Keep in mind, what we're trying to do is create a shade. We're not trying to create a perfect float or a perfect dry brush application of paint. We're trying to create a shade or a highlight so that we can create dimension within whatever we're painting. Now we're going to continue and we're going to discuss some of the problems that I see when my students are dry brushing. In this situation, we have brought out the shade into the proper area, but there's a very harsh line in between the two. So what you can do is you could use the base color, or you can use the shade color to try to bridge the two, or you can mix the two colors together, and that's what I've done. The background was white and this was a light blue, so I've mixed those together and made even a lighter blue. And I'm going to try to just bridge the two together. And sometimes this takes multiple applications. Now I can see that's softened a little, but not enough. So then what I did is I just loaded the background color, which was this white, and I'm going to go over it again. And that's softening a little bit. So we're going to let that dry, and I'll come back and I'll reinforce it so you can see that it's going to take multiple layers in order to correct this. Now the next problem I often see is the student has worked it, and somehow there's a hole in the center. Well, what's really easy to do is to load your brush as if you were going to dry brush, and then you just come in and tap in that hole. So this is completely dry, so all you did was to come in and tap it in, and you see, poof, it's gone. When you're working with cones, the problem I often see is, again, the student likes to hug the edges and not fill it in. Remember that when you're creating form, you're not just following shape, you are also having to create dimension. So these corners have to be completely filled in and then softened. I think cones are the hardest shape for students to understand how to create. Okay, now in this situation, I tried to show that the student has put in the highlight, and it looks fairly good, except for it's the wrong shape. If you look at it, it's straight up and down. The bottom part has to be a little bit wider, so let me turn this around. So again, I've just loaded my brush with the same color that I used initially. And I'll come back up, and what we'll do is we'll just kind of add just a little bit off to the side. And so it will be more of a triangular shape. And it's very important that I have this gradation. So we fixed that. And then also, let's go back to our circle. and see if I could reinforce this and get this to dissipate now that I have a little bit more. See if I can get this to dissipate now that the line is broken up a little bit. So I'll come off on this edge. And I have the white background in my brush. So I can see that this has really softened a lot compared to the hard edge that was there, but I'd have to come in a third time. But that's not unusual because I'm using white, and white's a very transparent color. So now my cylinder, and it's the same thing where the application of paint was brought out all very nice and smooth and even, but again, a hard edge. So in this case, I would bring it out with a little bit of the same color that's here, because I want to just bring it out a little bit further. If I use the white, I would make it smaller. So I try to think about the size of the application of shade or highlight that I'm working with to determine whether I'm going to use the base coat color to fix it or whether or not I'm going to use the actual shade or highlight color. But see, now that's nice and soft. And again over here with the highlight, it was just nice and wide, but there's not really much gradation to it, and there's a hard edge. And we have a super hard line right here. So in this case, I'm going to try to go over it with my highlight color. And it might take multiple applications. I wanted to show you that with dry brushing, it's so easy to correct the problem as opposed to other techniques like floating and all the more advanced floating techniques. And the reason it's easy to correct is because it dries so quickly. So I can see that I would probably need a little bit more application there, but I think you have the concept now. And so we're going to go in and we're actually going to talk about how to create form to this surface, and this is a cylinder. So essentially what I do, I always put my brush in the brightest and lightest section of the highlight. So I would start using my circular motion. And then I would come back up and work off of it. I'm having an upper right hand light source, so that's why the highlight will be kept on more a little bit towards the right hand side. And I want to make sure that it goes all the way up to that edge. Okay, I want to give it some gradation. I kept that nice and wide. And likewise, when we put the highlight in this sphere, I'm going to come in the upper right hand section. If you divide it by 4, this is the upper right hand side. It should not be off to the side. It should be just in this upper right hand quadrant, and I'm using my slow circular motions. And I'm just really lifting my pressure right now so I can just have some nice gradation to this. For the cone, I will turn it upside down and pull it towards me. So we're going to start out and we're going to make a wider motion. And I'll quickly come up the center. And I could be using a much smaller brush. The smaller the brush you use actually is, the better it is, because you're able to get a lot more gradation. I'll show you. So I just quickly switched over to this brush and reloaded it. So I have a little bit more room when I'm working with a smaller brush to bring in the gradation. So it's the opposite of floating, where floating I use as big of a brush as possible, but because you can keep going and going and going like the ever-ready battery with a dry brushing technique, it's much easier to use a smaller brush to get these nice gradations. And remember, you don't want to have any hard edges anywhere. And now we're going to go in shade. And what I really like about these brushes is I can go up in this little teeny, there's a little teeny triangle there. And then I'm going to work it out. Now this is a little bit too subtle of a shade color, so I'm going to come in with a little bit stronger color. And hopefully it's not drying already. So I'm going to go up in that little triangle and then come down along the edge. And see how I use back and forth motion, and then I start using my circular motion as I come out. And I start lifting my pressure and blending this away so I do not get that hard edge. Now, if I had a hard edge right at this point, I would come in with this base coat color to soften it. But I think this is looking really nice. And it would be the same with the sphere. I just come in with the tip of my brush and go back and forth, and then I start adding more pressure to make it a little bit more wide. Finishing up on the tip of the brush again. And then I come in with a lighter pressure and start fading it away. Now I'm only showing you one shade and one highlight. And it really takes 5 values to create form. Three-dimensional form. Now I'm going to go in and do the cone in the same manner. So what I do is I start wherever the whitest area is going to be, just like I did with the highlight, and then taper it up as I go. It would help if I were to move into a smaller brush right now, so I'm going to just use less and less pressure on it as I go up. Now underneath here I need to roll that back, but in this situation my brush is too big, and that would be easy to do with floating, so I would just come in and float that. So the next step that I wanted to show you when I'm working to create realistic form is I don't just do dry brushing by itself. I come back in and I float. So if you've watched my advanced floats, I'm going to show you how I then combine dry brushing with those floats. So now with the cylinder, the dry brushing is completely dry. So if you remember with a back-to-back float, you dampen the surface first. If your dry brushing was not completely dry, this would lift off. So it's very important that you make sure that your application of paint is completely dry. Now I'm going to come in and I'm going to put a back-to-back float over this. But I'm going to walk it out just a little bit and cover the exact same area because this is my first application of color. Then I flip my brush over and meet it. I have a little hair there. And I'm walking this out. So you can see how this is so smooth and even now, and it's a really nice highlight, and that's because I've built up multiple layers. And it was really fast to do, because if I'm in the middle of painting something, then I can come in quickly, dry brush, float over it, and move on to the next application of paint, because the dry brush application dries so quickly. Now with the shade color, it would be the same thing. Where I'm going to come in, and this is where I'm going to walk out a float, because I want to make sure that I cover the same exact area that I did in the first place. So you can see there's absolutely no streaking here at all, because I had that first application of color down. But then I'll actually come down underneath here and add a little shade. You can come in and float in here. You could also dry brush a little bit too. I'm going to say that this is a concave cylinder. So we'd come back here and put in a little highlight in the back. Okay, so now with our sphere, it's pretty much the same thing where I'll come in. And if you remember when I do my circular floats, I really like using a filbert. I'm going to dampen the surface just a little bit because I'm going to be merging floats together. Then I will come in and I will put my brush down in the same place every time. And I'm walking it out a little bit because my first highlight was fairly large. So I think that looks pretty good. And I'll also come in and float to shade, reinforcing it. Now one thing I wanted to point out when I was pulling the shades to the sphere is when I came over, I did not just pull them straight as I was bringing out my dry brush or walked down the float, because then that would just completely flatten it. The shape was curved, so I followed the shape of the object that I was painting. So I'm going to chisel pull, bring my brush down, and finish with the chisel pull. And then I'll go back and just walk up over where I had originally dry brushed. And we're already starting to get some really nice form there, even though there's only 3 values. I would repeat and do the same thing with the cone. You need to learn how to recognize shapes within a design. In this situation, if you notice that there's 2 straight edges right here, this is the cylinder. And so there was a really nice wide highlight right in here. and the shade, first shade came all the way over here. This is one of those curvy edges that I had pointed out earlier, where you have to make sure that you follow the shape of whatever you're painting. Now there's a little bit of a cylinder in there, there's a little bit of a cone, but basically if you're going to create dimension, you have to follow the shape, bring in all here's the shade over here, here is the highlight. Notice how I said this is somewhat of a cone, so it's wider at the bottom and comes up. And then we have a darker side and a lighter side, so we're rolling this back. This is also a little bit of a cone here, so that it's somewhat of a triangular shape highlight. The base of the teapot is more of a sphere, and so we have a nice circular float. And see how the shades are pulled, or more like in a letter C than like a L shape. And that's what's giving the volume to it. The T is a cube, and so you're going to have just walked out floats on this. Now, even though this is a triangular shape, it's not a cone because it's in the cube family. So you're going to just fill in and create a nice corner float or dry brush it in, but you're going to not create a rounded effect. Up here on this top of the teapot, there are two cones. So you can see the difference where this is curving, it's not flat. And so then we'll have a triangular shaped float and a triangular shaped float over here where it's going to be making it look more round. And then the little teacup, it's pretty much just a half of a sphere. So it's almost a U shape that I created. I wanted to also show you this particular design because there's a lot of organic shapes to it. With the ribbon, a piece of fabric can just make all kinds of folds and unique shapes to it. And so in this area, it's a little bit concave, so you can see that it's folding in there. And that was all dry brushed first and then floated over. This was dry brushed first, and then I came over and I did a flip float over that, or back-to-back float over it. You can see we have two spheres, and they're connected somewhat with a cylinder with a pair. And so we have a circular shape float, and then again, this is curving, the shade is curving over here, giving us the nice depth that we want. The one thing I wanted to point out here is you can see this little red area, and how that's a red accent. This could be really difficult to do if you tried to float it in, but if you come in with absolutely no paint in your brush, hardly at all, you can easily dry brush these accents in, and they just look so pretty because it's just like a kiss of color that you've given it. And then on the leaves, they're pretty much flat planes. They're just kind of coming in. There's not a lot of curves or uniqueness, and so that's why there's a lot of highlights on the outside edge, and then the shade is mostly in the center. And then, of course, the berries are spheres also. I hope this has given you a general concept of not only how to dry brush, but then also knowing when to dry brush and when not to dry brush. And how also then that dry brushing helps to create form when you combine it with the more advanced floats. I hope you're enjoying this series on acrylic painting techniques, and please subscribe, and then also please give me a thumbs up so I know that you like it. See you in the next video. Bye.